Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard. Recently I did a video on the Polymega and its history. If you haven't seen that video yet, I recommend giving that one a look before sitting through this one.
Why should I?
Well, because in this video, I'm going to take a look at alternatives to buying something like the Polymega. Now for this video, I'm only going to look at x86 based modern PCs. So I'm not going to look at other things like single board computers. I may do that separately down the line. Now there's a lot of different computer options out there in this day and age, so I'll tell you what sort of things that you're going to be looking for, what is a must to get the kind of performance that you would get out of something like the Polymega, and what accessories, if any, you would have to add for that full Polymega-esque experience. At the end of all this, I'll also show you performance on two different types of computers, so you can see what your end results might look like. So let's recap briefly what the Polymega is. It's this thing here. But more specifically, it's a retro game system that's been delayed for a few years that should really be coming out very soon now for sure, they promise. Anywho, it's sporting an unspecified Intel CPU, has 2 gigs of RAM, a custom Linux-based OS, and licensed version of emulators that have existed for years. It goes for $450 on the Polymega website, and the base unit has a CD drive to play actual CDs of games for the TurboGrafx/PC Engine CD, the Mega/Sega CD, the Neo Geo CD, the PlayStation 1, and the Saturn. Part of the Polymega's deal is that you can also buy add-on modules to use your old cartridges and controllers for supported systems. Each module supports one specific system, and they cost $80 each. Currently, there are 4 modules available for orders/pre-orders/ whatever the hell phase of ordering the Polymega is actually in right now. So we're going to kick things off by taking a look at various different computers and what sort of prices they're going for today. Keep in mind as I record this, it's March 2021, and computing prices are generally, well, pretty up right now. You see, the reaction of chip manufacturers to the whole pandemic thing that's been going on for the last year wasn't quite on par with what they needed to do in order to meet demand. So because of that, prices are up right now on a lot of things. So to anyone who might be watching this video in the future and thinking, stuff doesn't cost that much, well, in March 2021, yeah, that's what cost. And of course after that, we'll take a look at what the accessories would cost that you might need, and discuss whether or not you actually need them. When I'm done with that, I'll show you RetroArch up and running. At least the most current version of RetroArch, which as of this recording is 1.90. I'll also be using the most popular interface, at least the one that's most popular as of the time that I'm recording this. Now do keep in mind, this is not a tutorial video. I'm not going to show you step by step how to get everything, how to set it all up, and how to configure it. What I will show you is how to launch CD-based media using real optical discs from within RetroArch, since that's kind of new to the program. If you need help getting things configured, if you need help getting BIOS files or figuring out where to put them, or finding games, well, you're just going to have to ask Uncle Google about that. Alright, so the Polymega base unit is $450 plus shipping. You have a few options to beat that price to performance ratio. We can go full desktop, small form factor desktop, or mini PC. Basically, for a computer, we'll be looking at between $100 and $400, depending on exactly what you want. If you want to do this on the cheap, pick up a used computer like this on eBay. A full desktop is handiest, so you can easily change out parts and upgrade it if you want. But you can also go SFF or small form factor computer if you don't care about upgradability. Now I actually bought something like this myself years ago and my kids still use it every day. I upgraded mine a bit over time, moving it to a full-sized case and then adding a better power supply and a decent video card. But you don't need to do any of that if you're just going to use it for retro game system emulation. If you want to go brand spanking new, you'll be paying a little more as you'd expect. In today's market in March 2021, generally something that will do the job will cost you between $300 and $400. Whether you go new or used, the important thing is to look for a quad-core or better CPU It can turbo up to at least 3.5 GHz. Look for recent-ish Core i5s on the Intel side, or Ryzen 5s on the AMD side. Note, the oldest of i5s were dual-core, so you want to make sure to avoid those. And the first generation of Ryzen CPUs may also not perform the best for these. But anything current in the i5 and Ryzen 5 lines should be fine as long as the speed is where it needs to be. Lastly, you can look at mini PCs. Why? Well, they look nicer sitting next to a TV. Or at least, they're easy enough to hide behind one. But if you want one that's powerful enough for the best Saturn emulation possible, you'll be looking for one with a Core i5 or Ryzen 5, and those are in the neighborhood of $350 to $450 right now. The key takeaway here is that you can get something that will do the job fine for about $100 if you're good with buying used. Otherwise, it'll take about $300 to $400. But you'll get a computer that can run way more systems than the Polymega. So even if you end up paying about the same price as that system, it's still really a big win for you, since you'll be able to do so much more with it. And of course, the Polymega doesn't just come with the base unit, you get the things you need to make it work, like an HDMI cable and a controller. So we're going to factor that in and see what that costs. Aside from that, on a computer, we're going to need something like a mouse and keyboard in order to interact with it, so we'll factor that into the price as well. Finally, depending on the size of your hard drive or whatever internal storage you get, you may need to add a little more, and if you didn't get a computer with an optical drive and you want to read actual CDs, you'll have to get one of those too, so we'll look at all of that and consider all of that in our final pricing. If you just want a no-frills keyboard and mouse from a reliable seller like Amazon, it's about $13. You can get them for much less than that if you shop around, though. If you get a computer that has less than 256 gigabytes of storage, I'd probably suggest adding some more. We can throw in a decent brand 256 gigabyte USB 3.1 drive for about $20. Unless you want to store a ton of CD images on your drive, though, you probably won't really need to add storage and can skip this entirely. On the controller front, you can get anything you want. I'd recommend an X-input controller since it'll make your life easier. Alternatively, if you want something more fitting for playing classic games, something like the 8BitDo M30 might be up your alley. Anyway, expect to spend about $30 or so on a controller. You can use most modern game system controllers pretty easily on PCs these days, so that's an option too, and it won't cost you a cent if you've already got one. If the PC you get doesn't have an optical media drive and you absolutely must have one because you insist on having it read your discs during emulation, well, fine, be that way. Also, it's about $20. Oh yeah, and an HDMI cable will go for the princely sum of roughly $3. The bottom line here is that if you don't already have any of this stuff, plan on spending about $85 on top of whatever you already spent on the computer. If you don't need any of these items though, you can skip them entirely and spend exactly $0 on them. Next up, I'm going to cover actually running the games. So we'll see RetroArch, what the interface looks like, and how games work in it. Now I'm going to show this to you on two different computers. The first is a modern mini PC that's less than $200. It's a Teresa model. I have no affiliation with them, so I'm not trying to sell this to you. You can look at anything with similar specs and you can expect similar performance. So this Teresa mini PC is using a quad-core Intel Celeron J4125 that turbos up to a blistering 2.6 GHz. It's supposed to be 2.7, but when I monitor it, I've never seen it go that high. Still, it should be fine for everything we want to run, with the exception of Mednafen/Beetle Saturn, which has heftier system requirements. After that, I'll show you some stuff running on a modern upper mid-range computer running on an AMD Ryzen 5 3600. Now that chip turbos up to 4.2 GHz, which is significantly above the hardware requirements for something like Beetle Saturn/Mednafen Saturn. And as I said, I will be using the most current, stable version of RetroArch, which as of time of this recording is 1.90. Now the version of RetroArch that's available at the time you watch this may be different, because of how time works and everything. Let's start things off simple with the PC Engine / TurboGrafx CD. Generally speaking, everything runs great. The games look and sound like they should. We'll take a gander at a few games here that I launched from CD images that I made. Okay, and now let's take a look at using real physical disks. So you've got to insert your disk and load the emulator core you're going to use. It doesn't matter which order you do those two steps in. Once the disk is in and the core is loaded, just click this option here to load disk. That's all there is to it. This is Exile, by the way, about as mediocre an action RPG as you'll ever find. Why am I using this game? For the super in-depth and complicated reason that it was at the top of my TurboGrafx CD stack. Anyway, load times are dramatically faster than on a real system, which you'll notice if you've ever experienced this game on actual hardware. Yeah, it works pretty good, but I'll admit right now that it's not perfect. The problem here is that the Redbook audio tracks don't loop or repeat correctly. What happens is, when a track ends, it loads and plays a bit of another track before self-correcting that mistake and then restarting the first track, so that'll need to be ironed out. This doesn't happen with CD images stored on a drive. This only happens with real, physical media. To make sure this wasn't just an issue with Exile, I tried this with 3 other real CDs, and every game had the same problem with the audio not repeating correctly once a track completed. So I'm going to assume that all or at least most of the Turbo CD games have the same issue when using them with RetroArch right now. And it's too bad, since Magic Engine, a standalone paid PC Engine emulator that came out over 20 years ago, doesn't have this problem with real discs. Next up, and also relatively easy to emulate, we have the Mega / Sega CD. Yep, looks pretty good, doesn't it? Here's Batman Returns with all of its hardware scaling glory. We'll follow that up with a bit of Sylphie. Hey, look, it's one of my favorite games of all time, Lunar Eternal Blue. Here's Final Fight CD. Yeah, as you can see, there are no problems here. For physical media, I decided to toss in RoboAlesta, why not? And you know what? I tried it with Pico Drive first, and apparently Pico Drive doesn't support physical media right now. Bummer. But I tried it with Genesis Plus, and it worked just fine with that. Audio was synced, and I didn't notice any of the repeat / looping problems that were present on the TurboGrafx / PCE. Alrighty, here's the Neo Geo CD, and yeah, it runs fine. While we look at a few games here for the Neo CD, I'll tell you about a few features that RetroArch has so you know how things compare to the Polymega. First up, you can save and load states. You can enable Run Ahead to reduce input lag to the point where you'd theoretically experience even less input delay with this than you would on a real system. You can enable Fast Forward and Rewind functions. You can run real-time machine translations of games that are only in Japanese or some other language. You can set rapid fire keys or buttons. Not enough? Wait, there's more! You can have multiple save slots. You can adjust resolutions and aspect ratios to get the type of picture you like exactly. You can enable a bunch of different types of graphical filters. You can assign shortcuts for functions like saving and loading to buttons on your controller. You can launch recent games from the history. You can get thumbnails, metadata, and a whole bunch of other stuff if you want to pretty up your experience. Also, you might like to know that you can do netplay with this. Neat. Alright, enough about all that. So you can see that the Neo Geo CD, yep, it works great. I didn't try a physical disc for this one, because the very few that I have are packed away. So as you can see, anything 16-bit and below is going to run just completely fine, even on a low-powered mini PC like the one that I'm using here. Now if you're wondering what I'm using to read real CDs on it, I bought one of those cheap little USB external drives that I showed you earlier. The one I have is a different model. Again, I'm not hawking anyone's wares in particular, so anything you get should be fine, as long as it's compatible with CDs. So now that we've covered all that stuff, let's step into the next generation with the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn. PlayStation. You know this is going to work fine. You've seen me run PlayStation games on a $15 single-board computer. You can get multiple PlayStation emulators. You can use something like Beetle PSX, which is one of the more accurate ones out there, and gives you a ton of options you can control. If you use it as is, you'll basically get output that's very similar to the original machine. If you take a look at the options, you'll see you'll have fancy features like being able to render the polygons and textures at much higher resolution than the original hardware. It's all up to you how you want to run these games, it's just whatever you like best. If you find that Beetle PSX is a little too slow on your hardware, usually indicated by staticky sound, then I'd suggest using PCSX Rearmed instead, which will be fine for most games and offers a lot of similar features. Alright, we'll look at just another game or two real quick, since there are no real issues to report with PlayStation emulation. Yeah, that's enough PlayStation, right? It works as you'd expect. I didn't try physical media with this either because, like with the Neo Geo CD, my PS1 games are packed away at the moment. Tells you about my priorities, doesn't it? Anyway, I've seen plenty of videos showing that using physical PlayStation discs works pretty well in RetroArch. Alrighty, here we are, the main event! Emulation's bad boy, the Sega Saturn. Like with the PlayStation and other systems, there are multiple choices for emulators within RetroArch to use for this, and they have different purposes and feature sets. Beetle Saturn is based on the Mednafen Saturn emulator, which is probably the most accurate right now. As I mentioned earlier, the CPU requirements for this emulator are a bit hefty. Yaba Sanshiro and others will run on way lower specs, but are not as compatible. Still, if the game you want to play runs okay on Yaba Sanshiro, then that's all that matters, isn't it? So here's Beetle Saturn on the mini PC. It's turboing its little heart out at 2.6 GHz, but it just doesn't have enough power to run Saturn games at full speed. Oh well, we tried. If we switch over to Yaba Sanshiro on the same game, however, yeah, things are looking pretty good here, aren't they? The problem is, like I mentioned just before, it's not compatible with nearly as many games, and even some games that work may have graphical glitches and errors here and there. Still, you can play an awful lot of Saturn games with this emulator. Just a side note, I have to tell you that the standalone version of Yaba Sanshiro worked a little better on the mini PC than the LibRetro version that RetroArch uses. So here's a little footage of that. Note that with this version, you can get full speed even on low-end machines while upscaling and rendering at higher internal resolutions than the actual Saturn. Now let's move back over to Beetle Saturn on the Ryzen 5 3600 desktop PC. As you can see, our results are much better here. The games that work are all full speed. And while I haven't shown it to you here too much, again I want to stress you can add screenshots, video clips, game information, and descriptions, all pulled from existing databases to make your user experience fancier and more similar to the Polymega. For me personally, I just want to run the game, so I don't mess with any of that. But if you want that stuff, hey, knock yourself out. As far as physical media goes, here's me running a stall off my retail Saturn disc. Yeah, it worked completely fine. There were no audio problems of any kind. No loading issues, no glitches, everything just worked. So if Saturn emulation is your primary goal, then you'll want to shell out for that slightly more expensive computer. As far as how it compares to the Polymega experience, yeah, you'll probably have to fiddle a bit more with some settings here and there on the PC to get the best experience, especially when playing high-res games like Virtua Fighter 2. So I'll grant the Polymega people at PlayMaji it's not quite as easy to play your Saturn games on a PC, but you can do it with what I would consider to be minimal effort. Alright, so I think we've pretty much matched what the Polymega can do very well at this point. The experience isn't identical, there are a few things that are a little bit easier on something like the Polymega, and I did give it props for that when those circumstances arose. But then there's something else we need to consider, and that's what can you do even on something like the cheap mini PC that you can't on a Polymega? Well, sit back and take a look just for a moment. You want 3DO? Bam! Do you love Game Boy Advance as much as I do? It'll be flawless on something like this. How about PSP? This mini PC handles most of its games easily. Can it do Nintendo DS? Yep. Want to play GameCube and Wii titles? That's a bit of a taller order for this computer, but you'll find a few that run okay. Basically, anything up to the PS3/Xbox 360 generation is within your reach on even a weak modern computer. If you have a mid-range or better PC with a decent graphics card, well, basically everything up to the PS4 generation that doesn't have the word Xbox in its title works pretty well. So if you don't want to be limited to the very small amount of systems supported by the Polymega, your world can be much, much wider, my retro gaming friends. In the end, you can duplicate most of the Polymega experience even on a very cheap, modestly spec'd mini PC. Really, you can get most of that experience on something as humble as a Raspberry Pi. Now, while it may have seemed like it, the whole purpose of this video was not to just shit on the Polymega or anyone that might enjoy using one. If you've got a Polymega, you actually received it and you're using it and you love it, hey, great! I have no problem with that. More power to you. The purpose of this video is really for the people who looked at something like the Polymega and said, hey, you know, I'd like to be able to do that stuff, but I don't know if I want to get something specifically purpose-driven like the Polymega that's that expensive to accomplish that task. Is there anything else I can do? Are there any alternatives out there? So as you can see, the answer to that question was yes, there are alternatives out there that will allow you to do that. And generally speaking, most of them will cost significantly less than the Polymega. All of them will do significantly more than the Polymega, though not all the options will run Saturn as well as it does. And frankly, in the end, you may not need to buy anything. If you've got a modern PC, chances are you'll be able to run everything the Polymega can without having to spend another cent. That'll just about do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe to the channel. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. And it would be super great if you could help spread the word about the channel, since that's the only way to help small channels like mine actually grow these days. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on both my whole premise here about comparing the Polymega to modern x86-based PCs, what hardware you might like to use to emulate the same systems that the Polymega does, or what alternatives you would use yourself. Go ahead and let me know about those things in the comments. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.